Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Debra Scacco. I am an artist based in Los Angeles, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Systems in Concrete, a conversation about the relocation of LA Chinatown as a result of the building of the Stack Interchange and Union Station. I want to thank Los Angeles Public Library and Land for co-hosting this event. This event launches phase 2 of Compass Rose, which is a creative collaboration rooted in community, history, storytelling, and cartography. The project started as a collaboration with OxyArts in 2018, where together with various departments at Occidental College, including Institute for the Study of Los Angeles and Special Collections, we founded Nila Stories, an ongoing storytelling archive for long-term residents of Northeast LA. With the second phase of Compass Rose, we're inviting stories citywide that share the ongoing impact of displacement by infrastructure, which is what inspired today's conversation. Compass Rose is a collaboration between Occidental College, OxyArts, the Sanborn Map Library at Cal State Northridge, Los Angeles Nomadic Division, and of course, Los Angeles Public Library, where eventually we'll be hosting an exhibition featuring contemporary oral histories, historic Sanborn Map indexes, and new artworks resulting from the multi-year research process. And now, with great pleasure, I would like to introduce you to today's speakers, Glen Creason and Eugene Moy. I like to say I've been bothering Glen Creason since 2013, when I first took the escalator down in LA Public Library and asked him to look at maps of highways and the Los Angeles River. Since 1979, LA native Glen Creason has been the map librarian at the LA Public Library. He's author of the brilliant Los Angeles in Maps and has written for multiple publications, including Los Angeles Magazine and City Lab. You'll find him referenced everywhere from KCET to LA Times, and of course can learn more about his work on the YouTube series in Stories from the Map Cave, LAPL's brilliant series of shorts from the Map Archive, where Glen tells stories of the city through the archive's maps. Glen says his dirty little secret is that he has no sense of direction, which makes me feel better because neither do I. Eugene Moy professionally worked for cities in Los Angeles County in planning and economic development, but has also been engaged in community history, serving on the boards of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California and the Chinese American Museum. As for setting the record straight, better to say that he's interested in learning about the history of our community from the street level, from the people who live and work here. Glen has very generously prepared a presentation of maps from the LAPL archive to use as a starting point for this discussion about the history of Chinatown. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Glen and Eugene. Thank you so much.
Well, I wanted to start with this quaint-looking map. This was done by the Women's Club in 1870. Well, it was done in the 30s, but it depicts Los Angeles in 1871, and why that's important is because it's not the railroads have not connected the city, so there's still a lot of the Pueblo in the city, and it's painting this sort of rosy picture of Los Angeles. Now, this is down towards the Pueblo, and as you see, 13 is Chinatown. Now, this is one of the very few maps that even recognizes a different side of Los Angeles. So here you have the Chinese parade. It adds color to the city. It's exciting. It's good for tourists and everything. But then here is one of the places where there were vigilante hangings. And Eugene, I'm gonna turn it over to you just to talk about the Chinese massacre and the size of the community at that point.
Yeah, well, it's sort of ironic that the ladies chose this particular date. It just so happens that this past Saturday was the 149th anniversary of the Chinese Massacre of 1871. At that time, the population of the LA Chinese community was under 200. And because Chinese were a sort of a visible presence in the old plaza area, and because of just continuing maybe racial attitudes and maybe the attitudes of the community toward anybody who was foreign or exotic. There was it didn't take much to spark an incident of violence in which 18 Chinese were murdered. They were either hung, beaten to death, or shot. So this was one of the truly great milestones in LA history. We have this long history dating back to the Spanish and Mexican period. The advent of the gold rush, et cetera, brought many people to California and to Southern California, which had land available for development. There was a lot of growth. But unfortunately, in this kind of a competitive environment, like in many other places, it didn't take much to really set off the locals. So there was a little bit of the vigilante justice motivation behind it, but also just a lot of anti-Chinese feelings had been emerging. Maybe you can move on to the next.
Okay.
Glenn.
Well, this is fairly in the public imagination after the railroads came and the city moved, and we're going to see a map later that'll actually show how there was like a civic center and then there's a business center. So this is a Dakin Atlas. This is from the map collection here, and this shows Chinatown when it's really becoming the Chinatown of social history. So up close you can see that Chinatown was a place where it was sort of known as a wild place where, even though the status quo clucked their tongues at it, it was a place they might go visit, for fun. And you can see this is a whole row where it says HO of IF, a polite way of saying houses of ill fame. There's also gambling. You can see there's an opium joint, there's tenements. So on one hand, you have the Chinese, there's a Chinese community there, but then there's this draw of sort of everything goes down there. But at the same time, you have churches, you have a Chinese theater, places to go and shop. So there's always this dichotomy between this is where the Chinese theater was. There's always this dichotomy between the actual people in Chinatown and then this draw and this picture of it as a wild place.
Well, a lot of the early Chinese were looking for opportunities, just like immigrants from many other places, whether it was the French, the Germans, the Jewish community, the English, others who flocked to LA. So, if gambling was a popular occupation or a popular recreation, or if opium smoking was popular, it wasn't the Chinese themselves who always participated in these. If you look around today, if you walk into a 7-Eleven, and more than likely it's owned and operated by an Indian person, or you go into a donut shop and it's operated by a Cambodian, it's not because people like to eat and drink those products. It's because it's an economic opportunity. So I think that a lot of the early Chinese found a particular niche in these particular enterprises. I should point out that the houses of ill fame were not necessarily run by Chinese. Maybe a few of them were, but there are many that were operated independently by others, whether it was the French or others.
And the ladies were not necessarily Chinese. They were all different ethnicities. And
Right. So, so the location of Chinatown really sprouted up in the oldest part of LA, and it was right adjacent to the old plaza area. What you're seeing here in this map is the center of the city, and then just to the right, you see this block that says Chinatown. So obviously, there was more dimension or detail than this one block, but sometimes map makers tend to be a little bit take a little creative license and don't always show really all the actual details. Oftentimes when there is a community that seems a little bit strange or exotic, from the mainstream perspective, then they would just sort of create one little block and then identify it as such. I should point out that the north edge of what is shown as Chinatown here was a street called Macy, and then right across was a Mexican neighborhood. And just across there was an elementary called Macy Street School. It's an existing building. It's 3 stories high, and it was a location where the Chinese and the Mexican kids went to school, keeping in mind that up until only a few decades ago, in the early first 100 or so years of LA, we had a lot of separation of the races. So, if you or by separation by economics too. So if you're in the poor part of town, and you would go to the school in the poor part of town. So that particular building is still standing. I'm hoping that one day we'll be able to get it landmarked. By the way, note also on this map, getting back up, see that on the right edge, it says Brooklyn. Now, what was the extension of Macy Street later became Brooklyn Avenue, extended into Boyle Heights and into East LA. But that was the center of a thriving Jewish community, a Jewish merchant community. Many people who had come from Brooklyn, New York, set up business in this particular neighborhood. This was a very mixed neighborhood. So I pointed out the Mexican, the Jewish community. Further to the north and west was where the French and later Italian communities settled in. So we had a very large French and Italian presence. And then just to the south, at the south edge, below where the blocks where it says Chinatown, was an area called, that some current contemporary historians call Frenchtown. They may not have called it back then, but C.C. DeBear has a website called, Frenchtown. I'll think of it in a minute, but there's a lot of great history that she has placed onto that website.
And can you just clarify around what year this is? This
is
era?
1894, the map. But
Right.
I think Eugene's talking about a broader.
Well,
I mean, this one here is turn of the century, maybe. So this gives you a look at the at sort of it's Chinatown on the left there, but
right. One of the things to keep in mind is that our communities are very organic. They're constantly in flux. So there are people coming and going. And part of it depends on the local or the national political environment. We had Chinese exclusion beginning in 1882. The alien land laws that prohibited Chinese and other ethnic immigrants from the ability to purchase land and therefore control their own destiny. So it was a challenge to grow up and live in this neighborhood.
And Eugene, can you just remind us of when the alien land laws were finally revoked? It was fairly recent.
Every state had had the ability to enact its own land laws. In California, in 1912, the California Alien Land Act was passed, and that was not repealed until something like 1952. So it was a fairly long period of time. But a part of the challenge was that the Exclusion Act made it difficult for a person to become a naturalized citizen. So, once you got here, you had to, unless you were actually born here and were protected under the 14th Amendment, it was a challenge to be able to achieve full citizenship rights.
And I think those land laws are quite important to remember as we discuss the relocation of a community in terms of what kind of agency that community is allowed to have in sort of controlling their own destinies. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to raise that.
This is a really good map in that it shows the Chinatown area to the lower left, but that was the area that was displaced for the Union Passenger Terminal, or Union Station. But the neighborhood to the north of Macy Street, you can see streets like Boucher, Garibaldi, Ogier. That was the Mexican-American neighborhood that mostly was torn down to make way for the LA Central Jail and later for the Twin Towers. So government activities have a tendency to follow the economics. The cheapest land is oftentimes the most vulnerable, no matter who owns it or who lives there. So in this case, here's a whole neighborhood that was displaced.
Ironically, a lot of the rancheros, those people that had lived on the ranchos once statehood came and they couldn't afford to pay the taxes, they ended up in Sonora Town. So they're like our founding fathers.
Right.
The reason I include this one is because it's a travel guide of the period. You can see, and also
I'm glad you showed this map, Glenn, because it shows some real pieces of California history. So you've got Chinatown in the center there. You can see the street names, whether it's Leon, which is a French name, named after the town. Commercial Street and Aliso Streets on the lower right were where most of the French neighborhood was. But in the center, you see Stockton's headquarters at the Avila House. Now, Avila House is on Olvera Street presently, and it's identified as the oldest residence in LA. But Commodore Stockton, Robert Stockton, was originally from New Jersey, became Navy Commodore, and he was a key person in the takeover of California from the Californios, from the Mexican government at the time. So he set up his headquarters in the Avila Adobe. Stockton's name is commemorated in the city of Stockton in California. In San Francisco, where some of us, my friends grew up in, might have gone to Commodore Stockton School. So he was quite a person. Actually, I should point out, and I don't want to take too long on any particular image, but Stockton was he was following the War of 1812. He was involved in the Navy in the Caribbean that liberated African slaves from some of the slave ships. So he was a key person in American history, and then later became involved in the takeover of California. So a lot of history is really in our immediate neighborhood of Chinatown and the Plaza.
Right. So This one I include. This is a map of the same period, but I include it because it has two of the railroad stations on it. So these are basically going to be replaced by Union Station much later. But
yeah, I think the city and the railroads jointly wanted to have a central location rather than passengers going to all of these different places. At the right edge of the map, you can see where it says Main Street, but just off of there is the river station that the Southern Pacific operated, and it is connected with the present day Los Angeles State Historic Park. Hopefully, in the future, there will be either not necessarily a recreation, but at least some recognition of the fact that that was where one of the major passenger terminals was located in LA.
And a very beautiful train station also. I know Union Station is a classic, but this now we're getting, this is 1909, and I think typically they say the heyday of Chinatown, when it really was larger and runs from like 1890 to 1910, somewhere in there. But this is a map that was sent out to entice people to come to Los Angeles, and you can see their Chinatown they have is a sort of like a beautiful garden spot. Sort of typical of booster maps. Yeah,
1909 was a period of tremendous political activity in China, and many of the Chinese American communities were involved. Dr. Sun Yat-sen went around fundraising, and there were militia that were trained to go and fight in China for its liberation, you might say, for overthrowing the Qing dynasty. So, and then I think that even with exclusion still in place, now Chinese exclusion was in place from 1882 to 1943. During this period, there was still economic growth. A lot of the community depended upon the Chinese workers, whether it was as household help, doing laundry work, as merchants, and doing restaurant business. A lot of the food grown in LA produced a lot of the fresh food, whether it's vegetables or the commercial fruit crops, whether it's oranges or walnuts and other fruit, were really handled by a lot of the Chinese. Many of the packing houses in the San Gabriel Valley, San Bernardino, Riverside counties, Orange counties were worked by Chinese workers. The Chinatown was sort of a central location where oftentimes the merchants became labor contractors who were responsible for connecting with ranchers and business people to provide the workers that would help Los Angeles grow. So LA Chinatown was kind of a hub, even with all of these legal and civil rights issues and immigration issues that were swirling over their heads. The Chinese here in LA were very enterprising.
So this is, sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
Oh no, it's just, I can't help it. Stop. Keep going. Like when
these are based atlases that are really interesting atlases, but it's kind of a sanitized version. So this is all the way up to 1921, and you can still see. I mean, we always have to explain that Negro Alley has nothing to do with African Americans. It was originally about the dark-skinned Sonorans who lived on that street, and then there was even worse changes in the name. But anyway, this is This is the Chinatown area in 1921, but it gives very little detail. You can see.
Well, the founders of LA in 1781, the pobladores, involved 17 families and 44 persons. More than half of the people among those 44 had African blood in them. Either they were full-blooded Negro, meaning African, or were mulatto, or mixed heritage. So for the people who built their homes or established their homes on a certain location along Calle de los Negros, that was where the darker-skinned people lived. That was all. But then, following American takeover, the either innocent or ignorant, we can use those terms
Yes.
online here. Map makers would just apply the term that they saw fit, and so
Right.
it became Negro Alley. That's
And right across the
corruption.
street.
Yeah.
Right across the street is a building you're familiar with, but they've misspelled that too.
Yeah, just to the west or up above it is the Garnier building. Now, importantly, to the left of it also is another building called the Jeannette Block, and that was one that was operated. Well, let me back up. Garnier was named after Philippe Garnier, who was French Basque. He and his brother ran the Rancho Encino out in the San Fernando Valley, and had other ranching and commercial enterprises, and also vineyards later. But he actually, Philippe Garnier, ended up being losing a lot of money, but ultimately partnered with another individual to start one of the first banks in LA. So he was a real estate investor and speculator. But it's important to note that he built that building specifically for the Chinese community. And it became a center of Chinatown. The Chinese American Citizens Alliance established its headquarters there in 1912. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association established its headquarters there. It started in 1890 and moved over into the building. There were other business and community enterprises. When my dad first moved to LA in the 1930s, he lived upstairs in the building.
Wow.
I have his Social Security card identifying that address, 419 Los Angeles Street. Anyway, to the left of it is the Jeannette Block. And then to the left of that is the Arcadia Block. Arcadia Bandini was from one of the early California families, married Abel Stearns. Abel Stearns was from New England, from Massachusetts, and ended up owning quite a few ranches and other properties. Ended up losing it all in the Depression of the 60s. And his wife, widow, survived him, married a fellow named Baker, and that's why there's a building called the Baker Block just above that.
Arcadia was known as the most beautiful woman in California at one time.
Oh yeah. So those buildings were gone by the time the freeways came. And so the Hollywood Freeway ended up doing was taking a path that went from east to west, which is from bottom of the screen to up, and taking out the area follow along Arcadia Street.
So here, these are just a couple of maps that we transition into when they're going to change Chinatown.
Yeah, you can see that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Eugene.
Well, so you can see the wide street area, Calle de los Negros, became absorbed into Los Angeles Street. And the buildings along Los Angeles Street then became the Garnier Block and the Jeannette Block.
I'll put in a a plug for my coworker, Kelly Wallace. She did a very nice blog on moving of Chinatown, focusing kind of on Upper Plaza right there. This is and this is just sort of the touristy look, as it was, you know.
Well,
Now,
it's a hilarious, Glenn. You know, that I think that's a funny pictorial because everything is distorted. You know, it's not in its proper location. So, you know, the block that says Chinatown was the location of old Chinatown, and it didn't have these pagoda-like buildings that you see there. The image at the bottom there, Paris Inn, was actually the hotel within the Jeannette block that I mentioned. So it's
so that's way off.
Part of the French community. And then to the left is LA City Hall, which was actually 3 blocks further south. So,
and that's 1926. So
yeah.
Now
so
this
took liberties.
So this is another. This is a cute little pictorial map, but the reason I wanted to show this is because it shows the stereotype. Here's the Chinese. One's smoking opium, one's doing laundry, and the other one's carrying water, I guess. But
carrying vegetables.
Yeah.
This is what our community faced. You know, this was the stereotype. You know, the perception from the outside world. As Glenn showed earlier, there was a mission, or rather a Christian mission. There were temples. There were various business enterprises. So this was sort of a late 19th century stereotype view. So this map maker took a lot of liberties.
Yes. So, and this is another example. This is even a little later, but this map was part of a brochure that was, you know, given to tourists. But the thing that's strange about it is it lists foreign colonies. Now, these are people that may have lived here for generations. But right at the top, you have Chinese.
Well, yeah. There's 2 ways of looking at this. You know, you can say, wow, you know, LA was a pretty diverse community. It had all of these immigrant influences. So, you know, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, Jewish. It's just, and today, ironically, you know, some communities are fighting to be recognized. In the old days, it was a way to sometimes establish boundaries that you couldn't cross. You know, there were some communities, some in LA County, for example, that were sundown towns who would have a sign that said, you know, at the bus stop, you know, you can't get off here after 6 p.m. if you're black, let's say. Or if you go to certain neighborhoods, there would be race covenants. You couldn't buy or rent in a particular neighborhood. So, but now that many communities have been here for decades, if not 100 years, people want signs and say, well, this is Little Armenia, this is Little Bangladesh, this is Chinatown. There's a growing sense that we should provide the respect to our ethnic neighborhoods that they deserve for their contributions to the growth and development of LA.
Right. But
Well, and Glenn, I'm really glad that you showed those maps as well, because I think one of the most impactful things I learned when we first started researching together is the sort of non-neutralization of maps, right? Which, like, I think this presentation shows really well, in particular in regard to the Chinese community, but you see it in racialized language across all sorts of maps. It's like, you know, generally maps were at one point regarded as neutral documents, and of course they're not. So I think what's important to note about this is the kind of culturalization, I think is a very generous way to put it, of certain communities and maps that eventually led to the ability to clear those communities in a sort of federally sanctioned way in order to make way for infrastructure, right? So that's just another thing to remember.
Well, we can't get into it, but the shoestring is a perfect example of the city hall wanting something and just bulldozing the people out of the way.
Right.
And covenants weren't restricted to like wealthy communities or anything. I grew up in Southgate, which is a blue collar suburb, and there was a covenant there. So
yeah.
So anyway,
I worked for the city of Southgate for 13 years.
Really?
One of the early residents of Southgate was Glen Seaborg. Maybe you were named after him.
Yeah.
Glen Seaborg. Glen Seaborg's family migrated from northern Michigan in 1920 and bought a little house on South. Now I can't even remember the name, San Vicente, but he grew up there, ended up taking the bus to go to UCLA. He went to Jordan High School. But one of the things that he noted was that his family, when they purchased their home, it was Southgate was, that particular subdivision was advertised as a pure neighborhood, meaning it was pure white, that there were race couples. So, I mean, he wasn't making any excuses for it, but he actually openly acknowledged that's just what his family came into.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
And by the way, race covenants were not struck down until 1948.
I just want to do a quick time check. So we're at 12:38, and I know we still have a lot to go through. So I think,
well, some of them we're going to go through faster, but
that's great. I just want to flag it.
Keep me posted, Deborah, because I can't see a clock where I'm at.
I know. That's why I wanted to flag.
But this is just a demarcation point of when they're starting to talk about, they're getting the land lust for this spot where Chinatown is, and eventually they're going to wipe it off the map. So, and that's what we're going to see in some of these maps. So this is, I should have put this a little later but this is what's going to happen when they've bulldozed what was Chinatown, and they're creating the new Chinatown, and then later China City. So,
right. The eastern half of Old Chinatown was torn down in the 30s, and Union Station opened toward the end of 38 and 39. In the meantime, the Chinese business community needed to find a place to relocate to. So the first enterprise that opened was New Chinatown at the upper left corner there, opened in May or June of 1938, and then later in the year, China City opened. The New Chinatown project was an enterprise where Peter Suhu Sr., who was born in Old Chinatown on Apabaza Street, went to USC, became the first Chinese American to work for the LA City Department of Water and Power. He had his skills and abilities to interact with the larger community and to interact with the railroads. And they negotiated, he got together a group of people, they negotiated the purchase of the New Chinatown site on North Broadway. The China City project was an enterprise of Christine Sterling, who had started Olvera Street in 1934. So this was kind of an extension of that kind of selling to the tourists. Basically, it was an opportunity to show a little bit of history and culture, maybe from a sanitized perspective, but it was pretty successful for a little while. Operated for about 10 years.
Yeah, that's just another look on a tourist map. And this is the same thing. There's China City. This is a streetcar map. It doesn't even, identify. But anyway, I'm just going to say a little short thing about these. These are Sanborn fire insurance maps. Debra's favorites. They were done originally to check risk of fire for insurance companies, but they turn out to be these incredibly detailed urban development aids. So this is just the index to one of those.
The Sanborn fire insurance maps identify the building material that each building is made out of.
Right,
so
and
all the wood or brick, how fire safe it might be, and it would also show accessory structures. So they're incredible resources for archaeologists who are trying to piece together some of the history of the neighborhood.
So, and what they would do is they would, as a neighborhood would change, they'd paste, clerks would paste little slips of paper over to show what changes. Now, we can see here now where they're demolishing parts of neighborhoods. Now, unfortunately, this happened all over downtown as the freeways came through and as the 4-level stack and all those things.
Right.
So that's the beauty of a Sanborn. And I mean, I don't, all I can see is the maps, but behind me, there's Sanborn atlases, and they're huge. Lots of fun to look at. There's a lot of serendipity when you look at a Sanborn atlas.
Yeah, so you can see the beginning of the impact of the freeway. The title of this presentation is about rivers of concrete. So you can see that there are buildings in red to the north at the top and the buildings in red to the south. And in between is the proposed freeway route. And eventually all buildings, and culture, whether it was Chinese or French or Italian or other, were kind of wiped off the map.
See, this is a closer look. You can see where it says proposed. I think there's one a little later that shows. Maybe it's. Oh no, this is the.
These are both new Chinatown maps.
New Chinatown, yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah. By the way, stop there. You can see that the new Chinatown Central Plaza is in the yellow on the right side. In the middle is the blue buildings identifying the greater Chinatown area, what we call the West Plaza area, or Chungking Road, where there have been many artist galleries and so on. But at the bottom there in lower left orange is the location of the French hospital, which opened in the early 1870s and operated as such for something like 130 years until a group of doctors took it over as the Pacific Alliance Medical Center. And now it's got a new name, Allied Pacific Health Care City.
Here's a closer look right here.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I was born in the French hospital, by the way. As many Chinatown kids were.
Wow.
Where just as an off, where did you go to high school, Eugene?
I went to Morningside High in Inglewood.
Oh, Morningside, so over in Inglewood.
Yeah, but I also went to city schools in South LA.
Yeah.
74th Street School, Horace Mann Junior High.
Okay. So what, Debra?
I was just going to say one other thing that I'd like to point out about the Sanborns. I think they're unique in that, while of course with the paste over you're seeing the most current update at that time of what's happening, but because you have this methodology of pasting over what was there, you can actually see how large geographic areas are impacted by urbanization and are impacted by infrastructure, right? So while other maps are current, which I use that term in inverted quotes, you don't have any sense of the history beneath. And one of the things about the Sanborns that I'm really drawn to is this idea that you can, on some pages, you can actually see the layers beneath it. And actually, Glenn, on one of the earlier ones that was like a large area of highway, you can actually see the colors, like just there, you can see the pink of the buildings beneath it. So you really start to get a sense of scale of how wide a sort of erasure is happening with these large infrastructure projects that then, in California mid-century, it was like the Stack interchange was on postcards. It was like a tourist destination, weirdly. So It's just really interesting to think about history in those terms and the Sanborns as a resource to see how history is constantly evolving, and how those communities are just evolving is one way to put it, but they're changing, right?
It's a shame they covered a nice compass rose here.
I know, I can see it. I can see it.
In the name of progress, oftentimes communities and both social and physical structures get eliminated.
Of course.
Now, to a neighborhood like this, this is New Chinatown, Central Plaza. But if the new DTLA, Downtown LA 2040 plan, is implemented, there is the potential, because of its relatively loose height and density controls, we could see many historic blocks replaced with 20 and 30-story structures that don't necessarily reflect any of the neighborhood's heritage. So that's a concern. Having the maps down is great, because we can see in detail really what the historic imprint has been.
Right. Well, and I think that also raises a really important question of, what is the balance between preserving culture and allowing progress, right? And so how do those two things live together also in a way that is equitable and that is actually caring for the communities who are going to be the most impacted by these developments?
So
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, on these, you can see there's the Hollywood freeway. It exists. So these are done in the 50s.
Yep.
But I don't know what this big open space is here, but what was going on there. But a lot of buildings were wiped out.
Yep. I just want to flag, we've got 10 minutes left. So
okay.
Glenn, I know there's a few more slides. So why don't we finish up those slides and then we can move on to a couple questions before we close.
Well, this one here is just a tourist map that shows modern day. And basically at this point, I don't want to denigrate Chinatown, because I really have had many good times there myself, except for one that we've spoken about.
If we hold it there for a second there, we note that the roadway at the lower part of the screen is really the Hollywood freeway. So it's cutting across the southern edge of what used to be old Chinatown. So the present day Chinatown is really not there at that location. And then we also on the left see the Fort Moore Pioneer Memorial. That was the former LA City, LA Unified Board of Education location. But it was also the location of one of the first cemeteries in LA. Following the Chinese Massacre of 1871, a few of the bodies were actually temporarily buried at that historic cemetery location, which was later replaced by the Fort Moore Memorial. Oh, actually, it became an Army fort.
So this is just the last slide, and it's just an 80s version of Chinatown. So that's it for me, Deborah.
Well, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you, Eugene, for just for sharing the archive and also for sharing your knowledge with us. I think we have just under 10 minutes left, so we can take a couple of questions. So if we can see those, we can try and answer them if possible. So yeah, we have a comment from Connie Lowe saying it's worth mentioning that Florida's Alien Land Act wasn't repealed until 2018, which I was not aware of. Eugene, do you have any comments on that?
As I mentioned, every state had its own rules for land ownership and citizenship, even or citizen rights rather. So it's an ongoing challenge. There's no unified leadership that really is helping to support the people of this nation.
I mean, I think in line with that, there's also, I know, Eugene, you mentioned racial covenants. So the sort of clauses that were put on homes that they could only be sold to white folks. And I know that those still exist in a lot of housing contracts, and those haven't been removed. So I think there's a lot of lingering policy that's still existing in our documentation and in our legal system today, because it's just been kind of left to sort itself out, which of course is extremely, extremely dangerous.
Right. But the race covenants cannot be legally enforced. But the fact that they're visible, and if you buy a deed and you have the title policy, you see it there, and it just sends a message.
Precisely. And I think in looking at the ongoing impacts of the way that neighborhoods developed, you can see the sort of you can see the legacy impact of these laws that many people are not aware of. They're not aware that the laws existed, nor that they are still, even if unenforceable, they're still in legal contractual documents that many people have in their homes. So I think that's really important to acknowledge.
Yeah, we need to have a lot of dialogue, between communities, and to really have discussions about how to address these issues of race and separation and isolation.
Yep. I did see a couple of other comments. A couple of other comments coming up just saying thank you, which I would echo to both of you. I haven't seen any other questions. So with that, we still have a couple of minutes. I wonder if we could speak very briefly about, I know we mentioned the Pacific Electric system very quickly, and this is kind of a huge question to end on, but I wonder if either of you would like to make a comment on that transition from public transportation to highways and how that impacted communities' ability to stay connected and to actually be active participants in the city before the highways kind of came in and created a new kind of boundary.
Well, I mean, that's originally that's what opened the city up to the common man, was the streetcars. And it also meant that you could live in Monrovia and work in downtown LA. So, but I mean, there's a lot of controversy over who exactly destroyed the streetcars. But it did not help the common man, nor did it help the city, Los Angeles. So.
And what's ironic is that now we are utilizing the same routes that the Pacific Electric and other streetcar lines used for our metro routes. So, we're finally getting a green line that goes out to the west side or to the airport, or we're getting lines out to the Inland Empire. But those were already there 100 years ago.
I hate to admit it, but I'm old enough that I rode streetcars, but Larry was the streetcar within Los Angeles. The PE was outside. But yeah, that was my father's idea of making a man out of me and my brother. We had to ride the streetcar to the Coliseum.
That's wonderful. Well, I see we had one question, which I think would be a great question to close on, from Aaron Paley, saying, any thoughts on how we might better acknowledge this history? Public art, markers. I'd love to hear from each of you on your thoughts on how, as a city, we can approach acknowledging these historically significant sites that help us understand how our city was built better.
That's a great question. Hi, Aaron. We haven't talked in a long time. The train stations, the metro stations all have public art, and many of them hire local artists or commission local artists to do art. And some of these art pieces do reflect some of the local community history. One of the things I would like to see is for Union Station, the main portal to LA, have more that tells the story of Los Angeles. This is, a million visitors come through there every day, or commuters come through there every day. And we don't have any indication of the fact that what is beneath their feet is the historic Chinatown of LA, or that across the street was the birthplace of LA. So with the Spanish and Mexican heritage and Italian and French and other histories here. So we really should use these transportation opportunities to improvements to use as an opportunity to educate everybody about our really global community that we have here.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, Debra, that it's funny you should mention it, because just in the last few months, our city librarian, we're involved in a project to do just that, to identify these public spaces, these landmarks, and so forth. So it is something that people, it's not just the library, it's lots of other agencies. So
that's wonderful.
Yes.
And actually what's funny, so I was supposed to create a piece at LA State Historic Park in April called The River Station, which was all about this. But of course that was, postponed due to COVID, but I'm hoping that it will happen at some stage, because I think the history of that land is so important. And the history of all of our land is extremely important, and remembering that history is vital.
And of the people who live there. So
absolutely.
All those stories and tell those stories.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great way to close. Thank you so much, Glen and Eugene, for sharing your incredible knowledge with us. Thank you to Los Angeles Public Library and Land for co-hosting this. And of course, thank you for everybody to everybody for spending your time with us today. Thanks so much. Everybody stay safe and take care. Bye.